The economics of the kingdom of God challenge people of faith in this nation.
Even as we all, as people of faith, depend upon the economics of capitalism.
The American Religious Town Hall is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here's your host and moderator, Pastor Jerry Lutz.
Welcome to the American Religious Town Hall. We're so happy that you've joined us today. We're going to be discussing a very important topic in just a minute, but before we do, we'd like to introduce our panelists to you, and I'm going to begin on my right with John.
Good morning. My name is Canon John Peterson. I am a priest in the Episcopal Church, canonically resident in the Diocese of Washington, D.C.
My name is Bishop Michael Olson, and I am the Bishop of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Fort Worth, Texas.
Hi, I'm Carl TROVALL. I'm Professor of Ethics and History at Concordia University in Austin, Texas.
I'm Dan Levin. I'm the Senior Rabbi at Temple Bethel in Boca Raton, Florida.
We're happy to have each of you here with us. It's always a privilege to discuss these interesting and important topics with you. And today we have a very interesting one about our view of economics. The Reverend Canon Jan Cope, Provost of the Washington National Cathedral, preached the most challenging sermon at the National Cathedral on Sunday, September 20th, 2020, when the United States recorded its 200,000th death from the coronavirus. In her sermon, Canon Cope challenged us to think about Jesus' parable of the workers in the vineyard, found in Matthew chapter 20, and what that says about God's economics and how we live our lives today. She argued that the economics of the kingdom of God are different from Wall Street economics, that the core of the biblical understanding of economics in the Hebrew Scriptures is Deuteronomy 15:11. Since there will never cease to be some need on the earth, therefore I command you, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbors in your land. The very essence here is justice, righteousness, and charity. In the parable of the workers in the vineyard, this parable is all about loving God and loving our neighbor. As Cope puts it, anyone overseeing an MBA program would not lift up this parable as a model case study on how to implement a cost-based analysis. But this parable gives us a glimpse into God's justice as Jesus prayed, "Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors." I'd like our panelists to address these three questions. One, who do we in the synagogue or the church really believe in God's justice and economics, or do we feel more secure with Wall Street economics? Two, is it fair to address both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament's understanding of economics, contrasting them to our economic structures today? And three, as we live through this COVID-19 pandemic today, millions are unemployed, and many of the safety nets that have existed for a large segment of our population no longer exist to ensure food to eat and security against home foreclosure. Therefore, how do we understand Jesus' prayer of forgiving our debtors? Fascinating topic, and we're going to begin again with Canon John.
Well, thank you so very much. Jan Cope, in all transparency, is a great friend of mine. We've known each other for years, and it's a privilege to be able to discuss her sermon today. I don't suspect there's a more important subject that actually can be discussed during this pandemic than what we're going to be thinking about today. The question that we're really speaking about is the difference between God's economics and whether or not we in the synagogue and in the church really believe, if we really believe and live in God's justice and in God's economics. I want to make one comment in relationship to the moderator's statement at the very end of his statement, in which he said, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Now that's Old English from the King James. But this is one time in which I believe the King James really has it right. For what we're talking about here is indeed debts and debtors. It's not forgive us our sins, forgive our trespasses, etc., but instead it really is our debts and our debtors. I think it is in Deuteronomy 15 that gives us an insight into God's economics. Since there will never cease to be some need on the earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy in the neighborhood in your land. God's economic means justice, righteousness, and charity. And how do we respond today? How do we respond in a pandemic? How do we respond in a neighborhood in which we live to this crisis that we are facing today within this nation? And what does it mean as a Christian to be able to, or as a Jew, and might I add, a Muslim as well? How does it mean to live in the neighborhood? What does it mean to live in justice, righteousness, and in charity? Now, the parable that we're looking at is the workers in the vineyard. And what is important to remember here is that the landowner was hiring day workers. This was not some employment of a person on a full-time basis, but it was day workers. And what the landowner did is he promised the person a just wage. A just wage is a denarius. You would not get wealthy on a denarius, but it was a daily wage in which you could support a family. And the question here is in relationship to justice, charity, as well as righteousness. And here, a scholar by the name of Levin has been very, very helpful to me in understanding this, because the day workers understood their whole issue as whether or not it was fair what they received, in contrast to the landowners' thoughts about thinking about this of what is just. A statement between what is fair and just. And therefore, the people who were hired at the end of the day and received a denarius, they did not think it was fair, but the landowner was thinking from the context of, indeed, what is just. Levin argues that the landowner focuses on the need of the people to make sure that the people had sufficiency. In contrast to the day worker, the one who had worked all day in the field wanted more money then as a result of, the people working only an hour got the denarius, so why am I not getting 10 denarius? And so the landowner could be symbolizing God and literally what it means in this case of being a just and fair landowner.
Thank you, Carl.
Yeah. Thank you, John. I really appreciate that. I love that interpretation of the parable, which was a fresh interpretation for me. I've always heard it in terms of, God welcoming people into the kingdom. And so it isn't we who decide the terms, that it's God who decides the terms. So I've always thought about it, and to bring in the economic aspects was fascinating. And my counter really comes as an attempt to ask a question, particularly in the first question, do we in the synagogue or church really believe in God's justice and economics, or do we feel more secure with Wall Street economics? And I think I have to say I'm really comfortable with both. Because God's justice economics is always a challenge for me, and I think that that's good. I think that you hit spot on. We need to take care of people. The flip side is that we can't upend an economic system that depends upon people paying their debts back that depends upon contracts being honored and people following through with it. Because I really hope, I mean, if Wall Street doesn't do that, I mean, my retirement plan's kind of in the toilet. And so, of course, I'm being facetious a bit. We depend on these economic systems, and it isn't that we can just take an economic system that we all depend upon and then just kind of dismantle it in the interest of the poorest among us. And maybe that's always the challenge, right? Maybe Jesus is saying, yeah, no, you need to give it all away. Yeah, don't hold back, Carl. And so I'm trying to parse it from the real challenge of, is this about me giving everything away to help everyone else? Or is this about me trying to reform a capitalist economic system that we have in a way that serves everybody, not just the very wealthy? So.
Dan?
So I think this is a fascinating discussion. In Jewish sources, the idea of free enterprise is enshrined in centuries of Jewish law, that you're entitled to open up a store next to somebody and compete with them. And that there was even in rabbinic times 2,000 years ago, when the law of the sabbatical year and the remission of debts was causing a credit crisis because people wouldn't loan money knowing that their debts would not be repaid, that Hillel, the great sage, created what was called the prospool, which allowed a sort of a workaround so that people would continue to lend so that there could continue to be an economy. I think the challenge that we see in Wall Street today is this religion there that the only reason a company should be in business is to provide benefit and profit to shareholders. And I think this very, very, very narrow look at what a corporate mission ought to be is really where we start to get into trouble. And that's new, by the way. The idea that a corporate responsibility should extend to the benefit of its workers, to the benefit of the community in which it does business, to the benefit of the country that sustains it, is something that I think is really, really important. There was a huge controversy a few years ago when President Obama said to business owners, "You didn't create that." And what he meant to say was, if you want to be Amazon, you can't be Amazon unless there are good roads, unless there is all the national infrastructure that allows that massive business enterprise to flourish. And people got very upset. They said, no, I built this. And they were right. Both of them were right. I think the thing that gets lost is the notion of equity, that there needs to be fair competition. There needs to be integrity in business life. But there also needs to be equity, and I think too often we think that people are competing on an even playing field, and they're not. And I think that what the sermon was pointing at was the idea that for those who can't compete or don't have the facility to compete, for us to say, well, too bad for you, is not in keeping with what any religious teaching, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, I think, has in the forefront of its consciousness.
Yeah.
Bishop?
It's a very good conversation, very good topic, and this sermon, is especially as reported by the moderator's statement, is certainly a catalyst for this type of discussion. What prompted in me was to think of, as she quoted this Deuteronomy quote from, "Since there will never cease to be some need on the earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbors in your land." What it prompted me to something that Leo XIII wrote in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, which is really kind of a foundational document for Catholic social teaching in the modern world and continuing now into postmodernity. And that is, there's really two types of poverty. There's the poverty that is blessed in a sense of contingent upon belonging to God and belonging to our neighbor. And then there's a poverty that's oppressive, which alienates and which puts people in the margins and puts them outside a sense of belonging. And we can't use the first type of poverty as justification to ignore the needs of the second kind of poverty, but rather that in a sense the poverty will never be totally obliterated. However, belonging can be corrected by our responsibilities, not only individually but corporately, to provide for society and particularly for family life as an anchor in society. One of the things that we went through and continue to go through in some sense, in some places, multinationally now, is how when the profit line is our sole measurement of success and flourishing, it can destroy the relationships within a family, where people become just simply cogs or tools and objects in an economic machine. And I think we have to work against that by working for this sense of belonging. And what do we take for granted that we overlook? And if we're taking things for granted, we're also going to be taking people for granted and disrespecting them. In this gospel reading and in this parable, I think simply that that God's ways are not our ways, but God calls us to change our ways to be in harmony with His ways.
Interesting. Yeah, Dan?
I think I remember a conversation I had recently with someone I know who was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And she was talking about how challenging it is to balance that need to deliver for your shareholders and to have corporate responsibility. She was talking about the most recent tax cuts that cut the corporate rate to 21%. And she said, well, if you're the CEO of a big company that has 99 million shares of stock outstanding, zippity-doo-dah, right? At the same time, right, what kind of a country do you want to operate your company in? Do you want to operate in a country that doesn't have enough money to be able to ensure that the elderly, the needy, the poor are given enough for health care, for their own sustenance? And one of the things I'm reminded is that Henry Ford, about whom I don't have very many good things to say, did have one brilliant notion, which is that if you pay your workers a really fair wage, they may turn around and buy your product. And that you can have some sense of synergy between the moral and ethical good and capitalist life. But it depends on how you want to employ that capitalist ethic in responsibility for the larger culture and society in which you live.
Go ahead, Charles.
I think that one other thing on top of that is other countries have a system in which if the CEO gets a raise of so much, the workers also get a raise of so much. In other words, in any corporation, everyone gets to share the benefits of the profit of that company, and that you can't have a division more than a certain kind of percentage.
Yeah, I think we're still just kind of suffering the effects, I think, in business and economics, with this kind of strip mining effect that we had with leadership, where corporate leadership, there'd be a hostile takeover, yeah, and a leader would come in, just decimate subordinate leadership, get the stock high, sell out, jump, and then watch the company just collapse afterwards. Yeah. And that, in some circles, was trumpeted as excellent leadership and the key to financial success, but it's not. In fact, it makes for a worse economy ultimately, but it also does so much destruction to humanity, and also really calls into question and introduces doubt into what the economy can do for us, what business can do for society. I think we in our country, sometimes I think we have a naive trust in what the free market can do, especially without regulation. It's an excellent way and the best way to adjudicate desires and needs and this with belonging, but some fundamental human needs, it really doesn't work. For example, health, because health is not healthcare. It's not really governed by the elasticity of the market and supply and demand.
Thank you. We've come to some really interesting conclusions here, and it's a fascinating discussion because I believe we're discussing the limits of individualism on which our society, to which our society kind of has aggregated against the community that many older societies were based on. And so the question is, can we have a truly, purely individualistic that isn't going to be destructive, or strip mining, a beautiful word for what some of our economy has done in the past. Let's go to a break, and we're going to come back with some summations.
We hope you are enjoying today's program. If you would like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the mission and history of the program, learn about the Town Hall estates, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, Pastor Lutz looks forward to receiving your letters. You may write to him at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. That's Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. Thank you for writing, and thank you for watching. And now, back to you and today's closing statements.
Thank you for coming back. We invite you to go ahead and use those addresses that you've seen. If you're watching us on YouTube, we'd love to know about it. If we're watching us in any broadcast or however you're watching, we'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to be able to make a program about a subject that you're interested in. And now we get to go to our summations. We've had some wonderful discussions, and we're going to start with Ken and John.
I hate to confess this, but in preparation for this program, I went back and read a sermon that I preached some 20 years ago. And I must say I was being critical of the landowner all the way. And maybe some of you will say it's maturity or something else, but now I find myself to be much more supportive of the landowner. And I'm supportive of the landowner because he said, and rightly so, that he would pay what is right. In other words, a fair living wage for each person. And I suspect that we have to ask, particularly of those who live, of us who live in $7 an hour states for minimum wage, whether or not that is right. But another thing in the text that Jesus did not tell us in the vineyard story today is whether or not the landowner really needed to hire so many people, or if he hired the people so that they would be able to have a living, so that they had a denarius to be able to pay the daily wage of what it costs to live. And so when we look at this story, I think we simply have to look at it from the point of view of that majesty of God and what Jesus was trying to tell us about God and a new system of economics of the kingdom of God.
Thank you.
Thank you, John, for I think you've laid out very nicely the constant prophetic nature of the church, right, in calling us all to account for how we use our wealth and are we using it on behalf of the poor. And Michael, you're going to have to forgive me, but I've been teaching in my ethics class the themes of Catholic social justice, and we had a long discussion on the preferential option for the poor. And I still find that to be very powerful. The students were very excited about it. And what that is, for those of you who may not know, and that's why I'm taken from your tradition here, that is that in any kind of decision we make, business decision, any kind of personal decision, how we use our wealth, how power, when we are electing people to represent us, the first thought is, since the poor can't defend themselves, what impact will this have on those who are the most vulnerable in our society? And it's just a great question to ask all the time.
Thank you, Carl.
There's a passage in the Talmud where the rabbis ask, what are the questions you're going to be asked in your final interview? And the first question they say is, did you conduct your business affairs with integrity? Which implies that you need to conduct your business affairs. You need to have the application of industry and hard work and innovation, and assume that you get to reap a reward from that. And that's a good. The thing is that you need to figure out how you move beyond that to other things. In Jewish tradition, the Hebrew word for justice is tzedek, and the Hebrew word for charity is tzedakah. It's the same word. Because you need to balance those scales. You need to create a platform where there can be fairness in business. And that if we allow for a holy society and use restraint and not just naked pursuit of profit, we can build that godly economy that will raise all ships. Thank you. Bishop?
I'm reminded of a story that's used as an illustration of heaven, in a sense where people's arms are fixed out where they can't bend to eat, you know, and you see people, it looks identical to hell, except that the people whose arms are outstretched in one room are feeding each other in a sense of belonging and sharing. I think when it comes to economics, it's the same principle that should apply in every aspect of our life, and that is me first is really antithetical to all of the principles of each of our faith traditions and religion. That really we have to love our neighbor first. We love God above all things. And then also in loving God, we love our neighbor and are concerned for them, not just with an affection, but more importantly, a real sacrificial love in the sense that those who have less have to come first. Now, that's not to argue for a classless society or a society that's utopian without distinction. And so the principles of subsidiarity and solidarity are very important to balance our society within human dignity.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much. The charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy. And the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America, we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory, but in reality. Now, friends, until next week at the same time and over the very same channel, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. And may the God of all of us bless all of you.